Welcome everyone to the CASIS conference. My name is Jessica Davis and I'm the president of CASIS. We're very happy to be back this year with our annual event. And it's my pleasure to chair this first panel of our conference with some excellent guests who will have tons of insight to offer on intelligence and security issues in Canada. I want to launch right into it, but before I do, I want to flag that I'll be giving an overview of the state of our organization, plus making a big announcement during my closing remarks on Friday. So please come back for that, especially if you're a student. So today we have three incredible guests to kick things off: Tricia Geddes, Daniel Jean, and Leah West. Our format is about 20 minutes of comments from each of our guests, followed by a question and answer period. So I encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the formal remarks. So let's kick things off with Tricia. So Tricia Geddes was appointed to Deputy Director, Policy and Strategic Partnerships in April 2020 with the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service. This role is responsible for key partnerships in the area of strategic policy development, foreign relations, external review and compliance, communications, academic outreach and stakeholder engagement, as well as litigation and disclosure. So it's a small portfolio. Tricia joined CSIS in 2014 as the Director General of Policy and Foreign Relations. Previously, she held positions with the Canadian Armed Forces as Associate Director of Staff for the Strategic Joint Staff, as well as with the Privy Council Office as the Chief of Staff to the National Security Advisor and the Director of Strategic Policy and Planning in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat. Tricia graduated from the University of Toronto, Trinity College, with a combined degree in political science and peace and conflict studies. So Tricia, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Jessica. I appreciate the introduction. I'm very happy to be with all of you and with my colleagues from the national security community. The reason that I eagerly accept these invitations is, like so many of you, I strongly believe in the value of open and transparent discussions around national security. Of course, at CSIS and elsewhere in the community, we have secrets to keep, but the way we do our work, the challenges, opportunities, and expectations of Canadians need to be discussed and debated in an informed way. I don't think we have enough of these conversations, and I'm delighted that we're having another one of them today. Happy to do my part. I'm delighted to join two panelists that I know very well and have worked closely with in the past, and I think we're going to have a great discussion today. I think it's important that we engage with each other more, break down traditional silos, particularly between the civil service and out in the academic and stakeholder community, and that we integrate our thinking. So thank you for being here today and contributing to that much needed dialogue. Some of you, especially my esteemed co-panelist Daniel Jean, know that I have an interesting background in pandemics before I came to the national security community. I began my public service career as the Chief of Crisis and Emergency Communications at the Public Health Agency of Canada. FAC was very young at that time, and we were in the early days of contemplating thorny communications issues around vaccine prioritization. I recall leading focus groups about how to communicate with Canadians that the vaccines needed to go to the very old, leaving children out, for example, for now, should the virus be more aggressive in the elderly. So there is an interesting history lesson that I can bring to bear in some of that. Little did I know that my next job as a relatively new policy analyst in the social development wing of the Privy Council Office, I would one day get a call saying, drop the justice files, Tricia. There's this H1N1 thing that has popped up, and we understand you know something about pandemics. So that was a year of very long days, weeks, and months. From there, I moved to emergency management files, then on to the Strategic Joint Staff and D&D. And as Jessica mentioned, I have found myself astonishingly now 7 years at CSIS. So I will be bringing some of my comments today about the national security community and the impacts of COVID on the community, but I will be focusing my remarks primarily on what we experienced here at CSIS. I'd like to speak to you today about how we saw the threats to Canada evolve during this time, how we responded as an organization, as a community, some of the challenges and opportunities. But I also really want to spend some time talking about what it meant as managers and humans, and what it means for our work, the workforce, and the workplace now and into the future. So let me start by taking you back to the beginning. A quick little retrospective, if you'll bear with me. January 2020 arrives. The world's attention is drawn to a number of significant geopolitical events. Fires in Australia were burning at alarming rates. A US drone strike near Baghdad International Airport killed the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Iran launched new ballistic missiles at 2 US military bases in Iraq. Ukrainian Flight 572 was tragically downed by Iranian authorities, killing all 176 passengers, including 55 Canadians and 30 permanent residents. The impeachment trial of US President Donald Trump was beginning. The UK was withdrawing from the European Union. Overlaying all of this was a creeping awareness of the coronavirus. And I'm going to remind you that at this time, we're still just in January. For those of us working in the national security community, all of these events have impacts on us. We're monitoring them. We're trying to make sure that we understand them. We're contributing in the ways that we can. So this is a very, very busy time for us as the coronavirus migrates over to Canada. So as we all recall, in 27th of January, the Public Health Agency announced the first case in Canada. And on the 30th, it was declared a global public health emergency. February was a blur, March was a blur. I am reminded by my staff that the NHL, NBA, Major League Baseball were suspending their seasons in March. The Juno Awards, a favorite of some of us amongst here, was to be held in Saskatoon. These were all shelved. Schools were closed, borders were closed, and states of emergency were declared. Chaotic, confusing for all of us, both at home and at work. And I would venture, and we're going to talk a little bit about this today, particularly impactful for the national security community. So the national security environment and the community were changing all at the same time. We saw new threat vectors emerging immediately. We had to change and adapt the way in which we conducted operations. You can imagine that the traditional way where we might meet sources in a crowded cafeteria, in a hotel lobby, other places, those were not available to us in the middle of lockdown. So finding ways to be able to continue to meet with our sources, just as one small element of the type of work that we had to adapt immediately. We tried to work with partner agencies in the national security community, but of course, with people working from home, there was very little to no access to classified information. The systems weren't working as we were used to, and new technological solutions were required coming online, but with a lack of compatibility between many of them. All the while, we were managing, particularly here at CSIS, we were managing multiple offices of employees across the country and all around the world. And the circumstances across the country and around the world for our employees were very, very different. So trying to ensure that we were following strict public health guidelines while continuing to keep our operations moving was a tremendous challenge. On top of all of that, and perhaps most importantly in some ways, the lives of our employees were severely impacted by the pandemic. Those who had children were adapting to be able to manage to work with their children doing schoolwork at the table while also still managing to come into the office. It was extraordinarily exhausting dealing with aging parents. Some of them were immunocompromised themselves. So significant challenges on the human front. At CSIS, we have business continuity plans in place for emergency events. Of course, most government departments have those. Those plans contemplate events like floods, earthquakes, explosions, where the source of risk to employee health is our building, not each other. What few could forecast is how to adapt to a novel respiratory virus-driven pandemic that is now approaching 2 years. There were certainly vulnerabilities in our planning. The BCP plans are now updated, but at the time we had to adapt quickly and update how we operate. Waves of cases would increase, our staffing posture would decrease. We had significant challenges in operating from home, and this was the same for our partners across the community. Just as one example on the BCP front, we designate employees to be essential through that planning. But again, they're meant to be essential in the context of keeping us afloat for a couple of days. But you can imagine the discrepancy between the people that we identified as essential and their requirement to come into the office, particularly in those early days where we didn't understand how the virus could be transmitted. The stress placed upon those employees and the stress of some of our employees at home who desperately wanted to be in the office, who wanted to be continuing to work on operations. This was an extraordinarily difficult time, both for senior managers and for employees. But I'm going to pause on that for a moment. I'll come back a little later. I want to just shift for a moment and talk about the threat environment. Because while the world was adjusting to the new pandemic environment, so too were threat actors. The fluid and rapidly evolving environment caused by COVID-19 created a situation ripe for exploitation by threat actors seeking to advance their own interests. In 2020, our world became increasingly interconnected, with many Canadians working from home, conducting business, sharing and storing proprietary information on home computers, rather than via the more secure corporate networks in their offices. This presented more and much easier opportunities than ever for cyber actors to conduct malicious online threat activity. During this period, we observed foreign interference and espionage specifically targeting sectors involved in the pandemic response, specifically advanced research and development happening across Canada in biopharma, life sciences, supply chains, and so on. We noted, like everyone, inspiring examples of international cooperation to confront COVID-19, as well as the fierce competition between some states for access to PPE and therapeutics. Of more concern was our observation that some hostile state actors were attempting to leverage all elements of state power, including through the use of aggressive and offensive intelligence operations targeting Canadian life sciences research. While not new, this trend accelerated during the pandemic, and we believe it will continue to be a significant challenge as states emerge from an event that significantly challenged national economies. It is particularly noteworthy, I think, to dwell a little bit on how the targets of this modern threat have changed. In the Cold War era, when CSIS was founded and our authorities were created by Parliament, threats to the security of Canada manifested themselves largely as a government versus government competition. And our job was to help protect the targets of our adversaries' activities, which were largely aimed toward government interests such as military research and foreign policy strategies. Work that was mostly conducted inside secure government facilities by people with an understanding of the value of their work to Canada's adversaries. Today's threat is fundamentally different and much more complex. Our adversaries remain interested in government secrets, of course, but their priorities are broader. They are interested in advanced research and deep and emerging technology and big data. Their interest in these fields are often motivated by geopolitical and military competition, technological advantage, and economic competitiveness, all of which are now inextricably intertwined, and all of which relate directly to the kind of innovation and discovery occurring in some of the most cutting-edge areas of STEM research. The targets and victims of Canada's adversaries now rest primarily outside of the Government of Canada. Developments in the most advanced areas of research now take place on campuses and in research institutes across Canada by scholars who may not be properly equipped to understand the nature of the threat. Nor might they understand how they are being exploited, how to defend themselves, their research and their data from being transferred, stolen, or used for purposes much less benign than those for which they were originally developed. As the director of CSIS, my boss stated in her speech earlier this year, you may be thinking to yourself, I'm not a national security person, I'm a scientist, I'm not interested in geopolitics. Well, I can say with some confidence that geopolitics is interested in you. It is within this broad geopolitical context, fueled by the urgent need for governments to respond to COVID-19, that the service embarked upon an ambitious and for us completely new and untested whole of CSIS outreach operation. So I just want to use this as a bit of an illustration of how COVID, while it presented enormous challenges for our community, in some cases presented some really unique opportunities that I'm not sure that whether or not we would have properly explored had it not been for this event. So I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the diverse partners that we were engaging with at that time. CSIS had been advising Canadians of the dangers of foreign interference and economic espionage for a number of years, of course, but the high stakes involved in protecting Canada's interests during the pandemic led us to do differently. I would suggest that we started to deal with different types of government departments, and that could have ranged from public works and procurement, heritage, ISED, public health agency, brand new clients for us, folks that we unfortunately didn't have the technology or the systems, perhaps not even the clearances to be able to deal with at the time, but being able to ratchet that up and be able to work closely with those departments to deal with this new range of threats was really critical to our ability to operate. And again, probably was happening slowly over time, but the accelerant provided by COVID-19, I think in some ways afforded us some opportunities to create some much stronger ties than we would have otherwise. But I want to speak a little bit about one illustration of how we move beyond just where CSIS is traditionally focused on advice to government to moving out into a space where we're providing advice to a much broader group of stakeholders. So municipalities, businesses, and in particular, universities. At the very beginning of COVID, I have one branch, as Jessica pointed out, academic outreach and stakeholder engagement. We leaned very heavily on this very small group of people who traditionally have been out there working with universities to better understand the threat and to create some think tank-like partnerships. But instead, we pivoted. We initiated a Canada-wide outreach and engagement initiative focused on academia, research institutions, and private sector companies in the biopharmaceutical, life sciences, and data science sectors. We leveraged our expertise and our footprint of every region of the country and launched a nationwide outreach initiative to raise awareness of the key risks of economic espionage and protect these interests. We worked directly with the organizations to ensure that their work and proprietary information, in some cases directly involved in how we would be supporting the COVID-19 response, was protected and the jobs and economic interests along with it. In just a few months, our employees briefed more than 225 organizations, 2,000 life sciences and supply chain stakeholders who are now much better informed about the possible threat to their companies and sectors and had the information necessary to protect themselves, their innovation, intellectual property, and their employees. I would also say, though, while all this work was happening, I focused quite a bit on economic espionage and foreign interference. But I would say that while this work was happening, as if we weren't busy enough, we were also paying close attention to how online platforms were being used by violent extremists to continue the spread of harmful beliefs, including xenophobic, anti-authority narratives, as well as conspiracy theories about the pandemic in an attempt to rationalize and justify violence. Those holding these extremist views often attempt to create an online culture of fear, hatred, and mistrust by exploiting real or imagined concerns when addressing an online audience. Major global issues such as the pandemic can, and we did see them, augment extremist efforts to move their message from the fringes of society to the mainstream. We are aware as well that state adversaries are using the opportunity to exacerbate social and political tensions created by the pandemic to spread disinformation about pandemic responses in an attempt to discredit government efforts and diminish confidence in vaccine rollout efforts, to name a few. The last point I will make on the outreach piece is to point out how well aware we are of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on marginalized and racialized communities in Canada. For example, we know that COVID-19 increased anti-Asian racism in Canada. Moreover, throughout the past year and a half, we have witnessed various racialized communities be targeted by threat actors whose radicalization into the ideologically motivated violent extremism space was potentially accelerated by the conditions of our new normal. CSIS is working to protect these marginalized and racialized communities in Canada. We understand that they are often the first victims of malign foreign interference or of violent extremists. While most of our work is conducted outside of the public eye, we are seeing the pandemic's impacts not only on the threat environment, but on those communities who are being targeted by threat actors. So I'll leave you with a couple of comments about what was the overall impact when you step back and reflect, and where do we go in the future. I've talked already about some of the organizational impacts and the interrelationship. I didn't get enough time to talk about our interrelationship with the national security community, but I think we are all, when we're sitting back and doing our lessons learned from the pandemic, which we've certainly started to do, and how do we plan for the future, we've all recognized some very similar challenges in this space. Security and how we maintain security standards in terms of classification of documents, the systems that we use to maneuver the documents or the information around the system, those are really critical. I think that there were challenges that played out in terms of people having to adapt very quickly to supporting government decision-making during that time. Really, really challenging to figure out how do we do that in a way that still maintains confidences and secrets through our systems and our architecture and clearances of employees, et cetera. So that was a real challenge that we're all going to have to look at how we address that going forward, because I think it is clear to say that that hybrid work from home model is probably not going away, and certainly not going away anytime soon. For us to be a marketable employer, being able to still recruit and retain good people with the constraints that come with working in a top secret environment is a tremendous challenge for us. So how and whether CSIS and the community adapt to these shifts and find opportunities to pursue change, it's critical to us being able to continue to deliver on our mandate and our mission to protect Canada's national security. I will touch briefly on some other opportunities that exist, though. As I said, providing new ways to share threat information, being forced to try to deliver that in an unclassified means, I think was a good discipline to put upon us. I think it was really important that we realize we need to bring our information to our clients and the people who are making decisions where they are. So we have to find different ways of doing that. We also need to look better, deeper at the opportunities afforded to us by open source intelligence and our ability to be able to leverage that to be able to share information. So those are some real opportunities that exist for us. We're now at CSIS embarking on a journey to be able to address what we've seen as some of the challenges, but look at the future as a sublime opportunity to totally enhance the future of our organization. Some of the questions that we're going to talk to hopefully later in the panel and over the next couple of days will be, what role do we continue to play in some of these types of events? What role should we be prepared for when we look at events in the health sphere, or climate change being another one that we're obviously acutely aware of? What role do national security agencies play where these events can potentially have, as we've seen during COVID-19, where we've seen these events can have a massive impact on the national security environment? So those are all things that we are contemplating right now. But I would leave you just with a couple of thoughts about how we're managing the employee side of things, recruitment and retention. The last 19 months have really not been easy on our employees. Many of you are accustomed to working from home. Microsoft Teams, virtual meetings, being able to do this from your living room. It's not the case for our employees. CSIS was honored to continue our distinct and critical role during this time, but it certainly has taken a toll, and we need to continue to invest in supports for our employees to be able to manage these difficult circumstances. I don't know that it's known to most Canadians, but I think that it's important to note that most CSIS employees were in the office throughout the entire pandemic. We followed very strict public health guidelines and we adapted to the advice as it evolved. Our work in the area was guided by two principles, which was one, to protect our employees, but two, to ensure that we could continue to deliver on our critical mandate. That adaptation and having to be able to deliver those two things simultaneously was very, very difficult, but incredibly critical. We have a unique mandate. We know now where our limitations are in that space, and we know how to look to address those things, but it is going to be a challenge and it is going to take time. I am comforted by the fact, as I said, that we're not alone in this effort. The national security community, both here in Canada and with all of our allies around the world, are dealing with very similar types of issues. And I'm hoping that through the next couple of months, as we think forward to the future planning and where we might want to take our organizations, that we're going to start seeing new opportunities emerge for us to work together differently. So I'll end my comments there, Jessica. I've done my best. It's a very broad topic and you could take it in many, many different ways, but I'm going to give you those thoughts for now and look forward to lots of questions and answers about anything I may or may not have covered. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tricia. That was so interesting. You know, the historical overview that you gave at the beginning was this incredible reminder of the pace of activities and threats as we went into the pandemic. And when you describe the threat environment, like, I know intrinsically that it sounds complicated and busy, and then we're adding on a pandemic on top of that. The thing that really struck me in your talk, and I'll just leave this before we move in, I just want to say this before we move into Daniel's talk, is, you know, it sounds like COVID really accelerated changes that strike me as a net positive for CSIS and for the Canadian security intelligence community. But it also sounds incredibly disruptive for the organization and employees. Although I do think that, you know, as a net benefit for the community, that's great, but I'm sure that there's going to be lots of time that's going to need to be taken in terms of adapting to what those changes mean for the workforce, for the workload, et cetera.
You're quite right, Jessica, an accelerant and a disruptor. Very good way to articulate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. They were really interesting. So I'm going to turn things over to Daniel Jean now. So Daniel Jean was National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister from 2016 to 2018. Before that, he was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Canadian Heritage and an Associate Deputy Minister at the Treasury Board and the Privy Council Office. His career has also included 2 postings in Haiti, 2 separate assignments in the United States in Buffalo and Washington, and 1 in Hong Kong. He received a Public Service Award of Excellence and a Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers Awards for his efforts. Daniel graduated with an MBA from the State University of New York in Buffalo in 1988 and completed his undergraduate studies in 1982 at the University of Ottawa with a BA in Social Sciences, International Relations and Economics. He's a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, a distinguished fellow with the Canadian School of Public Service, an associate member with the Observatory of Multidimensional Conflicts at the Raoul Dandurand Chair of UQAM, and a member of the Strategic Council of the Network for Strategic Analysis. He's an active volunteer with Centraide Outaouais and a mentor with the Action Canada Fellowship Program. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you to the organizer for the invitation. I feel really privileged to be sharing this panel with people that I've known for some time and I have the deepest respect for, and I'm happy to see the number of participants that are online to engage with us in the context of this panel. Before we get to the impact of the pandemic on the national security community, I thought it would be crucial to situate the global, international, national security context when the pandemic surfaced. And I'll be very brief because Tricia covers some of those things. So just prior to pandemic, we had a slowdown of globalization, a rise of protectionism. We had a multilateral and international order that were challenged. Just think about on the economic prosperity, institutions like the WTO was very much stalled. We had regression on the nuclear front when you think about security. And if you think about health multilateral dimensions, The crisis response by the World Health Organization to the Ebola crisis in West Africa a few years before had been a challenging one. You had growing competition, geopolitical, economic, and technological, and that technological competition is very much at the heart of both geopolitical and economic between US and China. You had growing inequities. Globalization was good for a lot of people, but not everyone. Growing inequities as a source of tension, even polarization, not only between countries, but also within countries, i.e. rise of populism in many countries, even our neighbor to the south. In these fractured world societies, disinformation on steroids, powered by the scale of digital platform, is a growing threat to informed debate and national and international consensus to resolve wicked problems, difficult problems. Some of it is the result of state sponsors, some of it is the results of vested interest groups with an ill intent. So this appreciation of this context is critical to assess the impact of COVID-19 on the National Security Committee, but also to guide us in the way forward. I'd like to look at the impact of the pandemic of the National Security Committee through three distinct lenses. The first one, the relationship between the pandemic threat and the national security mission. The second one, the immediate impact of the pandemic on operational capacity. And the third one, looking at the longer term impact in terms of opportunities and concerns. So let's look at this relationship between pandemic threats and the national security mission. And in fact, I think you spent some time on it at last year's conference. When it comes to this relationship, we've heard arguments at the two extreme poles. On one hand, pandemic anticipation, early identification and response is better left to health experts, and a greater role for National Security Committee would add little value but undermine the focus and already stretched mission of the National Security Committee. At the other pole, protecting economic prosperity, global and national stability, and protecting lives of citizens is a key national interest and one that requires the support of the National Security Committee. You probably won't be surprised that as a public policy expert that has worked extensively on both broader national interests and national security issues, I will argue for a balanced approach, i.e. one where the national security community should be prepared to contribute, but where it has the skills and to make a significant added value to the national interest and effort. And I think that, through her opening remarks, Tricia gave a few examples of that I will actually pick to illustrate. So why? As a start, a pandemic of the magnitude of COVID-19 creates a major economic and social disruption that threatens international and national stability, and instability that would be a fertile ground for national security threats. Back in July 2020, in an article debating on this issue of minimalist versus expansionist definition of national security in the context of the pandemic, US retired Colonel Robert Hamilton reminded us that by the time the pandemic, so July 20, had already resulted in more American deaths than any single war except Civil War, the American Civil War, and World War II. And that the immediate economic impact of the pandemic was a 4 to 5% contraction of the GDP, a major blow to economic prosperity. So definitely there is, from a pure selfish venture, although this should not be another element for the national security, from a pure selfish venture, although this should not be what guide public service missions, is the impact of pandemic as a major disruption to national security institutions, priorities, and activities. Just think about the time and energy that Canadian Armed Forces had to devote to support in overwhelmed elderly care facilities. The longer term impacts that I will describe in a moment should also be a strong incentive for the national security to support a response to mitigate the pandemic, because it's also in the national and their own interests. Now, where to contribute? So if we agree that it may be in both the national interest and the national security mission interest to contribute, maybe a modest contribution, but where they add value, where is that added value? I'll speak about a few dimensions around intelligence. Early identification of the threat as a complementary issue to health surveillance, not to replace health surveillance. To keep, and primarily to keep countries, regional, international institutions honest and transparency. The ability for countries to identify early a pandemic and to respond swiftly is contingent on countries that are discovering a pandemic making it public as soon as possible so that all the right protocols can be triggered. So that the intelligence, I think, has a much more important role in terms of keeping people honest than just giving you a couple of weeks in terms of identification. I think the public health system would work better there. The source of the threat. Just watch the current debate over the origins of COVID-19. Was that the Wuhan lab? Was that the local market? Yes, at the end of the day, when you have an issue like that, a credible multilateral determination is preferable, but it may benefit from credible intelligence to support its investigation. And I'm going to give you a practical experience. I spent a lot of my time during my almost 3 years as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, working with my colleagues around the globe, putting pressure on Russia for their egregious behaviors vis-a-vis Ukraine. There was not one day that the Russians were more nervous of the international community reaction that when the Malaysian airline plane, Flight 17, was down in July 2014 while flying over Ukraine. And it's quite clear to me that the reason why the Russians were so nervous and running after the Australians at the UN to make sure that there would be some form of multiple process to look at it is they suspected that there would be intelligence coming back on them that it may have happened with equipment that was supplied to the rebels by them. And in fact, when you look at the actual outcome of that investigation, that intelligence was critical. So I think this is where it has a real value. I think the intelligence community can help public health in terms of assessment capacity. When you look at the recent independent review of the Global Health Intelligence Networks that was chaired by Margaret Bloodworth, former NSA, and provides a good understanding of the challenge of both gathering and assessing a multitude of distinct health events into an intelligence assessment that can guide a health risk-based response. I think there's tremendous potential there for knowledge transfer, for sharing of best practices, for cross assignments. I think that the communities can both gain. There is definitely a potential role in preventing the shortage of strategic supply, and there's an important role in terms of preventing and disrupting pandemic-specific threats. And I can go rapidly on this because Tricia did a very good job of describing some of the measures that they did in the context of the pandemic. If participants of the conference want to read more about that, the Public Policy Forum has put a number of papers on public service innovation. And one of them is on the work that CSIS did in terms of outreach during the pandemic to actually disrupt some of these activities that Tricia described. Now, there is also in there of the pandemic, given how violent, like how substantial the shock is on the economic side, on the social side, on the risk to life, there is a role for the national security community to be deputized in the response where it makes sense. So logistics, military transport, that makes a lot of sense for the Canadian Armed Forces. We saw military intelligence in other countries playing a role in terms of securing PPE supplies. Now, we saw what the SNI community has done more directly around the research facilities and the universities and all of that. Now, when you look at where are these added value that should be deputized, I think those that I've mentioned are probably more natural than, let's say, looking at our armed forces having to serve in elderly care facilities, because what really, this was the constat, this was very much, I think, the assessment by most people, these institutions were just too fragile pre-pandemic to be able to sustain a shock like the pandemic. So that is for some other experts to find solutions. Now let's look at the impact. I'd like to look at the immediate operational impact. I think Tricia has described some of them. Of course, it makes human intelligence interactions very difficult. From a military standpoint, preparedness and readiness for the military, some of their operations and other broader national security response were certainly either interrupted, delayed, some put on pause. There was definitely some impact on some national security related investigations, although I'm sure the agencies had to prioritize. And then there was this notion that Tricia has described, the capacity of the national security community to be able to perform in non-presential mode. While most of the public service had to move to a presential work environment, this was not the reality for many, many of the institutions in the national security community. I think we have to reflect that as much as they were challenged at first, and the rest of public service was challenged as well to make that transition, I think that we have to salute how the national security communities, who many of their employees have continued to work throughout this, were able to come up with an agile response, and just look at some of the actual things that Tricia mentioned. Now, from a human capital standpoint, aging demographics and challenge to bring diversity in the national security community were already key challenges pre-pandemic to attract talent. And when I talk about diversity in the national security community, I want to be very clear that I'm talking about two very important diversity. The first one, of course, that the national security community should be representative of Canada. But the second one as well, as you listen to the new role that CSIS must play in some of these asymmetric threats that Tricia described. As you look at the new roles that CSIS has inherited in the new national security legislations, more and more intelligence analysts are just not only people who work, read, and make very sound and good assessment, more and more they have to be able to go outside and translate that into Canadians, private sector entities, universities, and all that. And that means that they're in the middle of a major transition in terms of what their human capital is. Now, the pandemic has added a new dimension when certainly you're trying to compete with private sector and rest of the public sector in attracting that talent, but you're certainly one of the organizations where most of your work has to be in presential. Now, in defining the challenge for national security institutions that mostly operate on classified network, I want to offer my modest, and it's very modest, and it's very uninformed view on the future of work in general post-pandemic. While I agree that the experience gained during the pandemic will have a profound impact in redefining the place of work, my experience tells me that the sustainable change will be a hybrid model, one where maybe some corporate functions that require limited face-to-face interactions can be performed most of the time in remote location, but where knowledge workers in the public service will likely evolve in a more hybrid model, similar to what enterprise accounting and law national firms already had pre-pandemic, which is one of the reasons some of them were so agile in moving into that new environment. By this, I mean face-to-face in key interactions when the group dynamics adds value, and remote for some of the others. But even if the rest of the public service transition is to an hybrid work environment like this one, you can imagine that it remains a challenge for the national security who has to work in a highly classified work environment. It may not be able to offer all these opportunities. So there's a risk that it could put these institutions at an immediate disadvantage, particularly in locations of long commute and higher cost of living, for talented employees who are juggling with multiple roles, their parent, their profession, their caretakers of their elderly parents. It also doesn't, like the other public service institutions, have realized that they can actually virtually recruit employees outside the national capital region for jobs in the capital. That's more difficult, of course, for the national security community. So I'm sure that we're going to have to find ways to make sure that it doesn't become a major disadvantage. I'm sure that the national security speakers will also be able to have other immediate impact, but these are the immediate ones that I wanted to focus on. Now, I want to focus on the longer term impact. I could elaborate on a number of longer term impacts that the COVID-19 will cause the national security community, but in the interest of time, I'd like to focus on three key impacts that in my view will be at the heart of the ability to perform the critical mission. The first impact has to do with the threat environment and the mission itself. As described in my introduction, pre-pandemic, the national security was already struggling with a number of new asymmetric threats. Think cyber, disinformation, acquisition, sensitive IP, on top of their traditional threats of espionage, terrorism, peace and security, and then other threats when we go beyond the strict national security definition, organized crime and money laundering. The challenge posed by inequalities, both at the international and national levels, could lead to further instability and are a fertile ground for radicalizations or polarization that could result in violence. Also, the pandemic necessity has accelerated our connected world, creates huge opportunity, but it may also, at least until we beef up the normative framework, until we come up with the right protection measures, it may make us more vulnerable against cyber acts. Think critical infrastructure, think privacy, surveillance. So that's the longer term impact on the mission. I see two longer term impacts that have to do with two key elements when it comes to the capacity of the national security community to face this post-pandemic mission itself. The first one is the competition for resources to protect against an increasing threatening world in a tight fiscal environment. So I'm talking about competition for financial resources here. The second is the ability for the national security community to modernize its human capital strategy to sustain the recruitment and retention of talent. On the issue of competition for financial resources and tight fiscal impact. First, that's not my role to assess the specific value of various measures, but there is little debate that the economic and social impact of the pandemic call for a rapid stimulus and income security response, and that in relative terms, Canada was in a very enviable fiscal position to act at the onset. However, while necessary when the pandemic struck, this enviable fiscal position has now somehow diminished. There's a little bit less margin of maneuver. We're still in an enviable position relatively speaking, when you look at the debt to GDP. But when interest rates are going to inevitably rise and result in higher debt service costs, the journey to sound fiscal management will call for some tough choices. What could this mean for the national security community? Well, first of all, the strong, secure, and engaged strategy included significant investment, but particularly in the later years of the 20 years plan. The early years were relatively inexpensive. And as we recall of the strategy, it did not include investment that will be required to the modernization of the northern surveillance systems and NORAD. Two important initiatives in terms of sovereignty and our continental security, particularly at a point where competition for resources in the north may become a new issue. Defense, because of their sheer magnitude of its budget, has always been one of the first places to look for fiscal room in the past under a variety of governments. With regards to the rest of the community, the incremental efforts required for some of the emerging threats that I've described above, economic security, state sponsor or laissez-faire around cyber and nefarious activities, disinformation, undermining social cohesion and democratic activities. When you go beyond national security, growing concerns with gun violence, organized crime, money laundering, and cryptocurrency, all that coupled with traditional threats of espionage, terrorism, and the likes will challenge the already stressed resources of the community. There will probably be some need for investment, but so little money. Tough choices will have to be made. In this context, leaders of the national security community at large may wish to anticipate various financial scenarios to examine how they can reallocate and optimize existing or scarce incremental resources to the most serious threats. On the issue of competition for talent, the leaders of the community must do a serious assessment of the key elements required to be able to continue to attract and retain key talent for their activities. And I was really happy to hear some of the ideas and some of the things that they're doing that Tricia was describing. The likely hybrid work environment that will resurface post-pandemic is a serious challenge on the horizon, but it can also because of the need to work in a classified environment, but it may also offer opportunities. Beyond the issue of presential, not presential, like many employers in general in that tight competition for talent, the community will also need to work on their environment, their general work environment, to ensure that job satisfaction is at a premium. In recent years, CSC has been able to recruit and retain key talent that could have made a lot more money in the private sector by making it a cool place to work. I take our leaders in the national security are going to be challenged to create work environment that very much promote job satisfaction. So in concluding, in sum, Canada already had to navigate in a troubled world prior to the pandemic. While I tend to resist the two common observations that the pandemic has exacerbated everything, it has impacted the community in a few areas. Some of it may be more short-term and can be overcome, resuming investigation, work with sources, military readiness, etc. Some of it will have other impact that must guide the national security committee actions over the long term. On the issue of pandemic threat and national security mission, the role may be modest, but require in areas where the community can add meaningful value. But in my view, the two longer term impacts will be the ability to optimize resource against threat in a tight fiscal environment and their ability to attract and retain talent in the post-work environment. Daunting challenge and task, yes, but both through history and during this pandemic, the community has displayed agile and adaptable skills, and they will be well served to draw that momentum to retool to meet these challenges. Thank you, and I look forward to the exchange with you and the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Those were really interesting comments. Like with Tricia, I really thought that your overview, your strategic overview at the beginning to remind us of the context was really important to sort of set that framework for what we're really talking about when we talk about the pandemic. In particular, though, I also thought that your conceptualization as security and intelligence as an honest broker for public health and in a supportive role for public health was a really good way to think about how these things can work together. And then when we're thinking about, I think your comments too, in terms of the workforce are just so bang on. You know, I still talk to lots of people in the security and intelligence community, and these are all very real concerns and considerations. And in particular, your description of the challenge of a non-hybrid workforce for national security, this will be a detractor for some people. And this is going to be a serious challenge to have to mitigate in terms of the recruitment and retention of people. You know, certainly in the national security community, you can't beat the sense of mission. I think that's a huge draw. But the reality of things is that the logistics of commuting, of managing an in-person workforce are really complicated. And we only have to really think about the issue of parking at CSIS to illustrate that point and the contentiousness of that issue. But in all seriousness, I do think that you're very right about our security and intelligence community having to demonstrate a serious value proposition for this type of work. And you offer some very good and solid recommendations that I hope that they hear and take up.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And I think that your reference to parking brought some memories back to Leah, looking at her smile.
I think it brings all of us some memories, that's for sure. So turning now to Leah, and certainly last but not least, we're going to have Leah close out our panel today. So Leah West is an assistant professor of international affairs and associate director at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Leah practices, studies, and publishes in the field of national security law. She completed her SJD at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 2020. Her research explored the application of criminal, constitutional, and international law to state conduct in cyberspace. This year, Leah co-authored, along with Craig Forsey's National Security Law, 2nd edition, and is the co-editor of Stress Tested, the COVID-19 Pandemic and Canadian National Security, out next month. Leah, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. And as someone who had 11 years in the federal public service and still couldn't get a parking spot at CSIS, yeah, that's a memory that does not fade from my mind. So thanks very much to Jess and Thomas and everyone at CASIS for having me. As Jessica mentioned, I had the pleasure of co-editing along with Thomas Junot and Amar Singham, a soon-to-be-released volume that explores how the pandemic impacted the work of the national security and intelligence community and assess the community's preparedness, the change in the threat landscape, how existing cracks in institutions and systems like our criminal justice system were exacerbated by the pandemic, and how the community adapted to meet these challenges. The time that I have, I want to share with you some of the overarching themes and conclusions we drew from the work of incredible scholars and researchers who contributed research to this project. Specifically, I want to highlight key adjustments made and what lessons we should be taking from the experience into the future. And what I'm going to say is going to be largely repetitive of what you heard from the previous two speakers, which I think speaks to the outstanding research of those who contributed to our volume, but it never hurts to hear things more than once. So on the question of adjustments, just as we all had to adapt to life in the pandemic, COVID-19 forced, as you heard, the national security and intelligence community to adapt as well. A consistent finding across the community is that rather than adapt in completely unforeseen ways, the pandemic worked as a, here's that word again, accelerant, hastening changes that were already taking place in the community in three key ways. First, by shifting priorities. Second, through the adoption of new tech and the development of new intelligence products. And third, through increased collaboration with non-traditional partners. So on shifting priorities, the community most obviously had to revise expectations, as we heard from Tricia Geddes, of what it could and could not do with the staff and resources it had operating not only in an unclassified environment versus a classified environment, but where traditional collection methods and sources were disrupted. Collection, analysis, and dissemination of intelligence could not continue at a normal pace, especially in the early days, and less essential activities had to be abandoned or slowed down. Moreover, it rapidly emerged that reprioritization exercises could not merely involve reducing resources dedicated to less critical activities. It also had to include the commitment of additional resources to new priorities as threat actors evolved to take advantage of the pandemic. For example, prior to the pandemic, the Canadian Border Services Agency regularly initiated terrorism and security inadmissibility proceedings. Unlike the limited use of the criminal law for terrorism or other national security offenses, deportation of suspected terrorists or people involved in national security risks is a power that the government actually uses quite widely. However, as Simon Wallace found, the pandemic really did negatively impact CBSA's ability to enforce deportation orders, notably because of remote working conditions and because of reduced air travel. And it simply wasn't in anyone's interest to be deporting people back to countries where the risk of COVID was extremely high. He argues that the pandemic also created conditions, however, that allowed CBSA to reform its deportation posture by administratively closing thousands of open deportation files, which will allow CBSA to emerge once life resumes to normal with increased capacity, and that's a good thing. The COVID-19 pandemic also imposed adjustments on the Canadian Armed Forces, not only refocusing the priority to domestic ops, but also changing the nature of what could be achieved and accomplished in foreign deployments. This varied by the type of deployment, where maritime and air operations required somewhat more modest changes. Land operations, however, often had to be curtailed or ceased altogether, especially when they involved capacity building components, since training foreign troops presented a higher risk of COVID transmission. And I just want to speak for one moment on this sense of mission that Jessica just talked about in the national security, intelligence, and I would say defense community, and how important that sense of mission is. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic and everything the military has been going through really has stressed that sense of mission and what it is that the military is going to be tasked to do in the future. And I think this is going to be a continued problem for the military into the future. Now, on the second issue of tech and product, it comes as no surprise that the community's IT staff had an unexpected burden as thousands of employees suddenly started working from home, creating an enormous surge in demand for various services. As Bill Robinson explained in his chapter, CSI's Center for Cybersecurity in particular played a critical role in supporting the efforts of Shared Services Canada to provide secure and reliable access for online work for federal employees, both inside the community and outside the community. Now, the response also to more people working from home, though, wasn't just about getting more tech or getting more people connected securely, but it also created an enhanced warming to the use of open source information. Now, in recent years, the intelligence analysis community in Ottawa, as Stephanie Carvin writes in her chapter, has slowly but steadily grown more comfortable with incorporating open source information into its work. Even if some resistance remains, analysts have increasingly come to understand that the best analysis is the one that is based both on classified and openly available sources. Here, the pandemic again accelerated this pre-existing trend, and various analytical units, notably the Intelligence Assessment Branch of the Privy Council Office and the Intelligence Assessment Branch in CSIS, had to adjust to the reality of a proportion of their analysis working from home by first consuming more open source information and then producing more unclassified reports for clients who were also working from home. The third that we heard Tricia talk to, third trend that we heard Tricia talk to is the enhanced cooperation with non-traditional partners. This is, again, a trend that predates the pandemic, but has intensified since March 2020. In recent years, the community has had to significantly ramp up its cooperation with other departments and agencies like ISED and Elections Canada to deal with emerging threats such as foreign electoral interference and in foreign investments of concern. It's also had to learn to work more closely with actors in other levels of government and the private sector. CSIS and CSC, for example, have expanded their ability to work with universities, as we heard, and private companies to warn them against the growing threat of economic espionage. The pandemic has led to a rapid intensification of national security intelligence community's efforts to expand its ties with non-traditional partners. CSC's Cyber Center, in addition to its standard activities in support of the federal government, has increasingly provided cybersecurity advice and services to public and private health institutions, notably those involved in vaccine research and development. And as we heard with CSIS, the Academic Outreach and Strategic Engagement Branch gave, by our counting, by their counting, I should say, more than 400 briefings to private sector companies in 2020 alone. So looking forward to the future, having seen these trends, what questions should the NSIC be asking itself looking forward? Now, arguably, the most important high-level debate the community should be engaged in the post-pandemic era is the place of health intelligence in its work. So questions like, should the collection of health intelligence be given greater priority than it was prior to the pandemic? And should analytical units be delivering more products focused on threats to health security? In theory, answering positively to these questions is appealing, but in practice, as we heard from Danielle Jean, this could lead to difficult choices. In a context of scarce resources, when the collection and analytical capacity of agencies is already stretched by the diversification of threats Canada faces, from the rise of right-wing extremism, foreign electoral interference, and various threats to economic security, calling for more of a focus on health intelligence may be far easier said than done. Would CSIS and CSC and others receive budget increases to support a greater focus on health intelligence? We certainly didn't see commitments of this kind in the last election. So what other priorities would be downsized without additional resources to allow for a greater focus on health intelligence? At the very least, what does seem clear from the research in our volume is that one of the main lessons from the pandemic is that core members of the national security intelligence community will need to strengthen and institutionalize some of the links they have built with non-traditional partners. Outreach by CSIS and CSC with private and public sector research in particular offers a valuable model for the future in the health intelligence realm and possibly beyond. More broadly, as Jessica Davis and Alex Corbet assess in their chapter, the pandemic has shown the value of improving cooperation and information sharing between the national security and intelligence communities with various other sectors. And the answer, rather than a change in collection priority within the NSIC community itself, may be to build stronger intelligence capacity within the public health sector through partnership and training, and ultimately having both the public health and intelligence community learn to work together better and share more information. As for the precise tools the NSIC has to counter the pandemic and deal with the pandemic threat, I heard consistently that agencies had the authorities they needed to do what they were asked. And as a lawyer, this was the question I had. Did you have the legal authorities you needed, various agencies, to respond to the different tasks and the different challenges your organization was tasked with during the pandemic? And the answer was Consistently, yes. The one thing I'll say to that is the pandemic response in Canada was never federalized. Also, some elements of the response were not given significant priority, like enforcement of quarantine and public health orders, for example, and contact tracing, in the sense that we didn't see a lot of mandatory elements or enforcement of orders, etc. when we're talking about public health orders, so enforcing the law and contact tracing. So if this aspect of things had been federalized, in my chapter, I say that the federal government may actually have lacked the authorities that it needed. For one, existing legal authorities and emergency legislation in Canada do not allow the federal government to collect personal information of Canadians, like location data, for public health purposes. Where authorities do allow for the collection and analysis of data necessary to trace the spread of communicable disease or enforce public health measures, it's only in very narrow and specific circumstances that may not be necessarily sufficient in a truly national crisis. We now know, or at least we've relearned, just how long pandemics can last. And we also have the expectation that we are likely to face more and potentially even more deadly pandemics in the future. I think we need to consider whether the federal government will want to give themselves greater authority to track and trace disease and enforce public health measures, should we be in the context of another public health crisis. And I think that conversation, along with the question about health intelligence, but enforcement and tracking of public health crises, I think conversations about those authorities should happen now, rather than when we're staring down the barrel of another crisis. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Leah. That was super interesting. I particularly found it quite interesting. So you gave us this overall sort of tour of the S&I community and a little bit of how some of the departments and agencies have been affected by the pandemic. I thought the piece on the CBSA and its role was particularly interesting. It's sort of that disruptive adaptation that I think you were talking about, that's so interesting there. But you said something later that I thought was really the crux of the issue. It's sort of, how do we institutionalize new relationships, some of the positive changes that have been brought about, and the models of information sharing that have sort of arisen in the pandemic? And I think that that's a key question for everyone going forward. Then you also said something at the very end too, in terms of the more pandemics in the future. And I agree that this is something that we need to be prepared for, which leads me to the question that I want to ask all of the panelists to start with. I see that we have lots of questions in the chat, so I'll go through some of those as well. But it's on the issue, and Tricia mentioned this briefly in her remarks, on the issue of lessons learned. So what should our security and intelligence community be doing in terms of lessons learned? And how should we go about integrating those lessons and institutionalizing them, as Leah says, into our way of operating? What can we learn from the pandemic, and how do we go about learning that? So maybe I'll start with Tricia, because she gave me the initial comment, and then I'll move to the other panelists to share their comments as well on that.
Sure, Jessica. Lessons learned, one thing that the national security community is really good at is conducting lessons learned. And I think it's the operational bent that we do sort of tend to reflect and have formal processes. My last job with the military, they were particularly good at that, and about making sure it was integrated into future planning. A couple of things I guess I would say, for sure, the lessons learned has been happening throughout the pandemic. Formal processes were set up by the Privy Council Office and Treasury Board in particular, kind of launched out. I think in some cases they're trying to make sure that as they're guiding, returns to work, hybrid works, what are the best lessons that the government can collectively identify, how do we sort of support the public workforce going forward? The security community, we had a little cluster and we were having some ongoing conversations about it, because our lessons were, I think, in some ways quite different from the rest of the community. And I think Leah outlined some of the issues at CBSA, and both Danielle and I have spoken about some of the specific challenges to CSIS, but they're very, very relatable. So when we would have these conversations, we came to the conclusion that, as an example, the employee challenges that we experienced having to deal with the hybrid work model and not being able to really afford people much work from home. We've experienced that together. We've learned a lot, and not just from a pure technology perspective, but from a human workforce perspective. How do we sort of like learn from this from a management perspective about different ways in which we could and should continue to learn from those, both the things we did well and the things we did not as well. So there are some formal processes that are set up, but where I think it's going to be really important is that as we rebuild, we haven't even come out of this yet. So doing lessons learned while you still feel like you're in the middle of it is always a little bit of a challenge, because we're all a bit exhausted and haven't really had a moment to sort of pause. But I think it's really important that we do, because I think Danielle identified some areas where there needs to be investments probably made by the community. And whether or not that's new resources or not is not really the point. It's more, is there a better collective way we could be looking at some of these issues? I'll give you an example. We have top secret spaces, facilities across the country. That's not a secret. And the ability for other departments to leverage those for, whether it was a cabinet minister who needed to go in and take a top secret briefing, our review bodies, our committee of parliamentarians that needed to go in and have a secure space to work in, they tended to leverage our spaces. So going forward, does it make sense that we should look collectively at how do we build the right infrastructure and systems? And, back to, there's an opportunity here for us to look at this in a collective way, as there is probably more synergy if we do 2 and 2 is 5 when it looks at some of the bigger investments that we would need to make. Another area where we talked about is the workforce. So the technical workforce, if we're all experiencing similar challenges and being able to give them meaningful work and meaningful compensation, approaching that as a community now, I think is a really good idea. So it's a long-winded way of saying we're having some of them, but I think that there needs to be a more thoughtful and deliberative effort put to this for a very concrete and institutionalized response that we need. Because this has been the most disruptive event probably since 9/11, arguably, for us to have to deal with. And I think it's time for a proper reflection. Thanks.
Thanks, Tricia. Daniel or Leah, do you want to jump in on that question?
I'd say something quickly in terms of lessons. Lessons learned is critical, is always part of a continuum when you are looking at your incident response, both your performance, but also your, how it informed future crises. And what my view in the government is, we have a tendency to make them too long and too far away from when the actual incident occurred. And in this context, I think it was fantastic, for example, that the review on the global health intelligence attack was done so rapidly after, when memories are still fresh, people understand why it's important and why you should focus the mind. When I was, as NSA, coordinating the community, I will remember that one of our terrorist incidents in Canada, at the suggestion of some of my colleagues in the community, we had performed and presented a lesson learned to cabinet 4 weeks after the event, which means it was presented to cabinet in 4 weeks of the event. Within 2 weeks, we had already done the lessons learned, what went well, what could have gone wrong, what we should do better before, presented that to ministers with the view of doing exactly what Tricia said, wire it back into your protocols. And that's where the public service needs to do better. And the other place where they need to do better is to wire that in your protocol. You need to practice.
I'll just add that I do think there needs to be an element of transparency here on lessons learned. I think we've seen how beneficial the lessons learned post-SARS was or was not. It was not in terms of implementation, but it is in terms of public accountability. So us looking back at what was learned back then and being able to say, you knew this, you failed to do it. And it helps with transparency and accountability. And so I think that while some of the lessons learned will not be able to be publicly disseminated, I think a lot of what we're talking about is relationships, new product, tech, coordinating space. This stuff doesn't need to be classified, but I think it's important for the purpose of future researchers, for researchers to be able to support the community, and also for democratic accountability, that that lessons learned, ultimately whatever documents are produced to the greatest extent possible are publicly accessible.
Thanks, Leah. And you're certainly not going to get any pushback from me on the transparency issue, or from Thomas, who's sitting in the gallery with us. I just want to stay with you for a quick minute on the questions. You mentioned something in your remarks about how you think that the pandemic has stressed the sense of mission for the Canadian Armed Forces. And this is something that I've actually heard from a number of my friends and colleagues still serving in the Canadian Forces. And so I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit and tell us what you think that is going on there.
Yeah, and a large part of this is also coming from anecdotal evidence, right? Having spoken with, and in recent years becoming, someone who gets to sit in rooms where people talk about these things. And it is, I think you can't dislocate the pandemic from the crisis that is facing the military in terms of culture and leadership. But the two things, especially together, retracting kind of those foreign missions, or when those foreign missions did take place, them being very, very insular, so that people not on the ground, not having a ton of opportunity to engage with the communities that they're there to support or train. Or even when we're talking about naval missions, right? Not being able to go into port, right? It really does change the sense of mission. And we have seen a number of missions that likely would have been extended had the pandemic not happened. So our training missions in Iraq and Syria, for example, really collapse. And so you have an organization who's been directed to do things that are absolutely important, go into long-term care facilities, go up north in terms of facilitating vaccinations, et cetera. But I don't think really speaks to the core of why a lot of people join the Canadian Armed Forces. Plus, they're having this identity crisis at the same time around their culture and how people feel about leadership and the organization they belong to, how the Canadian public sees the military. So I think all of that is really disrupting the sense of mission. I think unless the Canadian Forces can refine a mission that speaks to all members, it's going to continue to have the retention issues that General Eyre spoke of last week. From what I've heard, the loss of Canadian Forces members in the past 2 years is close to 10%. So it's significant, and I think that is all going to have a really big impact going forward. And I really hope that the CAF can find a new mission, be it a refocus on domestic security and really emphasizing the need for that in the global climate crisis that we're facing, northern security, whatever is going to coincide with the government's priorities. But, again, we need governmental priorities and a foreign policy to lead that mission. And anyway, that's a bigger problem than what I can speak to right now.
Thank you. We're actually going to come back to that in a minute. So get your climate change question answers ready. But I do want to turn over to Tricia for a minute here, because we've got an interesting question for you. So you referenced extremists exploiting COVID by spreading conspiracy theories online and potentially using the crisis for recruitment. So can you speak a little about how CSIS approaches these online spaces? Specifically, how does the agency triage between legitimate threats and hateful speech that's not a national security threat? I think this is a sort of a question that speaks to the crux of the CSIS mandate.
Yeah, it actually does. That's a good question. I would say, we're really conscious about what actually meets our mandate and what meets the investigative thresholds, whether it's online or whether it's in real life, as my kids would say. It's really critical that we are incredibly diligent in that space. Before I get into the specific answer, the fundamentals of trust and confidence that the public have in us is absolutely critical to our ability to conduct our operations. So when you said you wouldn't push back against transparency, nor do I. One of the reasons why I'm here today, I think it's an incredibly important part of what we do for a living. And the review and accountability mechanisms that are built into our organization, which I think have been enhanced considerably over the last couple of years, really, really important. And CIRA and their ability to review all of our activities hardwired into our systems and so on, I think is really, really important. So there are mechanisms to ensure that we are being super conscious as I said, in real life or online about where we actually conduct our investigations. But I think my boss likes to describe the online space as sort of a bit of a funnel. So there's all kinds of things that occur online that are unbelievably unpleasant, as all of us know. But it is absolutely not illegal to be a misogynist, to be a racist, to be bigoted, to believe in a conspiracy theory. So that's all out there, and it's really appalling. But unfortunately, none of our business as CSIS. Below that, you get into the criminal space, and there's hate crimes and so on that are being promoted online. And that's the space where our law enforcement partners do a lot of that work. And then below that, at the very small edge there, that's where things are actually national security concerns. And we simply don't have enough resources to be able to devote to anything except for the national security considerations at the very end of the spectrum. So that's effectively those threat actors who are espousing ideologies that advocate and inspire violence, simply put. So that's where our act mandates us to take a look at those types of activities. So it's violence. It could be violence with a view to creating social revolution, the collapse of societies, with a view to establishing a new world order, whatever is fitting into that threat actor's worldview. So that's the area we're focused on. And I guess the last thing I would say on the online space, though, is that it's not simply, obviously, a national security or a law enforcement space. In fact, that's a very small piece of this puzzle. There are much bigger issues around society and respect and social cohesion, et cetera. So that's an area where, interestingly, I talked about different partners. Working with the Department of Heritage as one example over the last couple of years, it's been really great. Like, it's been a really meaningful conversation that we've been having with other government departments in the social space that have arguably a much more important role to play in that space in terms of the vastness of the problem. But we have a very specific and targeted element that we're working on. Hopefully that answers the question. Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, that was great, Tricia. Thank you so much for that. And it's so interesting, right? Because these issues are not separate. They're interrelated, they're overlapping. But at the same time, we kind of need to separate them out for the purposes of mandate. And so it is a difficult thing to do all the time. So I did want to turn to another question for all of the panelists. And Daniel, I'll start with you because I see that you've actually answered pieces of it in the chat, and I think that everyone will benefit from seeing that. But it's really the question of climate change and climate crisis. So my question for all of the panelists is really, how do we think that the disruptive event, if we want to, or probably disruptive series of events that are likely to unfold with the ongoing climate crisis, are going to challenge the security and intelligence community, the structure, the culture, all of these kinds of things. So Daniel, maybe I'll start with you on that one.
Thank you, Jessica. First of all, I would argue that we've already seen some of that. Certainly observers, when they've looked at some of the source of the conflict in Syria, have been able to document that water scarcity was very much at the heart of this. We've seen some of that in some other countries in Africa. In Canada, from a national security standpoint, the thing that is the most obvious to us right now is certainly what does increase navigable waters up north, what does increase access to natural resources and competition for these resources is going to mean from both a sovereignty and a national security standpoint. Which is why I've said earlier in my remarks that we've got some big files coming forward that are going to be important on that dimension. I think that our national security community has started to pay attention to these things, but there's a difference between paying attention and devoting more than just a running brief. And I think we're at the stage right now where we're going to have to devote a little bit more attention to this. In the whole dimension of what the world needs to do to deal with the warming of the planet, there is a tremendous risk if we're not successful for a number of both migration, but also national security implications if we don't do that well. So the national security folks have to keep an eye on that, but the rest of the public policy community has a tremendous weight on their shoulders as well.
Thanks. I just want to quickly follow up on one piece. So in your prepared remarks, you talked about sort of the security and intelligence community having a supportive role for sort of the health intelligence piece. Do you see something similar in climate change, or do you see them having a more lead role there?
Definitely a sovereignty and military standpoint, DND, I think, is a key actor, right? When it comes to the rest of the national security community, it will be more related to their direct mandate and responsibilities, and whether some of the impact of climate change call upon them to establish that as a priority and allocate resources. So it really depends. Some of them will be engaged more directly. Certainly when, it's difficult to think about what's happening up north and not thinking that the renewal of NORAD, the renewal of the North Warning Systems, and it also plays, like, it was interesting to watch some of the public reaction to this whole AUKUS thing in the last few weeks. But from a national interest, we must determine where our alliances and partnerships and devotion of attention and resources is the most important. We may be an important secondary player in the Pacific, important player, but secondary role, but we may have a much more active and important role to play closer to home.
Thank you for that. Leah, I know you've been doing some thinking on this issue as well. So did you have some wisdom you wanted to share with us?
Jess, can you just reframe the core of your question?
Yeah, it's really just a reflection on where you think climate change is going to push the direction of the security and intelligence community in Canada, and are we set up for that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the S&I community, I think there are obviously players who are going to have a more frontline role than others, and I don't necessarily think it's going to be CSIS and CSE. Migration is going to be a huge issue, which makes CBSA front and center. Obviously, collecting foreign intelligence to understand, future migration plans and risks and where we might see migration stemming from in relation, that is obviously something that CSE could really support the Minister of Foreign Affairs in. But so migration is going to be a huge thing, and that means IRCC and CBSA. Also, the military, right? The military, who do we call out for floods, fires, and pandemics? It's the Canadian Armed Forces, right? And so the military is going to be stretched to respond to those missions. It needs to be prepared for those missions, and it may need to reorient itself and its organizational structure to handle those missions better, especially if we start seeing them happen in more locations around the country at once. Having a single readiness unit may not be sufficient, right? We may need regional readiness units as an example. So I think those are kind of the two things that I see immediately on the front line that our community needs to be thinking about going forward.
Thank you. Those are super interesting points. Tricia?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. Jessica, as you know, we have two major parts of our act that authorize our collection and analysis activities. So those are unchanged. Threats to the security of Canada, violent extremism, sabotage, foreign interference, and espionage. So those are not changed. And then the other element of our act, which is section 16, which is about being able to collect foreign intelligence to support the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So those are unchanged, and I think those are important that we would anchor all of our activity, including in climate change, in those two spaces. But the other thing I guess I want to say is that, and Jessica, you know this almost better than anybody on this call, the service is really, really good at understanding and assessing the environments around it and the environments that Canada finds itself in. So, the assessment capabilities at this place, I'm actually really proud of the work that they're able to do. So understanding, what does climate change mean? I mean, we talk about mass migration, we talk about how that might, the shifts in society, whether it's caused by demographics, whether it's caused by climate change, all those factors, like those are important pieces of the puzzle for us to put together in order to be able to understand where those threats are going to emanate from. So CSIS is, out at the vanguard in many ways in terms of its understanding of the big environmental shifts. And I use environmental loosely here, but sort of also specifically. And so I think that we will, because this is something that will absolutely have profound impacts on Canadians, and it will have impacts on our national security, I think it's important that we are going to be in that space. I'll just leave you with, when the pandemic hit, upskilling our employees to understand how does vaccine production work, how do supply chains for that type of production facilities, et cetera, like what is PPE, all that stuff, you have to do a massive upskill. It's amazing though that you can wander down the halls here and find someone who used to be an epidemiologist who can kind of come into the room and have a conversation, and we can go and have conversations with other government departments and get a pretty good understanding pretty quickly. But I think that's something the service needs to continue to invest in, is anticipating the next threat and then properly understanding that environment. And, talking to people that work in innovation policy, talking to people that work in environmental policy, like those are aspects of the world that we need to better understand so that we're well positioned to support. But I obviously think this is another one of those big shifts that has obviously been happening for a long period of time that we're on the watch for. And I think that there will be certainly a significant contribution from the service.
Yeah, thank you. That's great points there. I think, when you're talking about people, learning about vaccine production, I think that, one of the things that the service has, and a lot of actually security and intelligence members, community members have, is people who have a facility with technical information, not necessarily the specific information, but I think that's a skill set that actually transfers really well. Like if you have the ability to understand very technical things in one domain, that often translates nicely into others, and you become a pretty good communicator of that information. So yes, so super interesting there. When I think about climate change and security, I also think about intellectual property theft of green technologies, and that, especially when they're being funded or partially funded by the government, as being such a huge issue. So we're running low on time. I do want to ask one more question of all of you. And I'm really seized with this issue of recruitment and retention. I think that the pandemic has been really disruptive, obviously across all these different societal sectors. But I think, especially in terms of our ability to demonstrate the value proposition to prospective employees, I would like to know from each one of you what the pitch our security and intelligence community should be making to people who are considering joining. What makes it a worthwhile thing to do, and how is that changing over time? So maybe Daniel, I know you spoke about this a little bit, so maybe I'll start with you and then go to Tricia and close up with Leah.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think it's a good segue to what Tricia just said and what you've also underlined. In the talk that I did on the future of intelligence at the Research Analysis Network conference last year, I was actually saying what Tricia just described, that somehow the skill set for our security and intelligence personnel had to evolve. They had to be able to translate the threat to people who are in private business and technology. They needed to understand technology. And that's why I underlined that when I spoke about diversity in the talent pool, it's both diversity representative of Canada, but also diversity in terms of that skill set. I actually think that, it's pretty cool. I think that to be able to tell people that nowadays, because of the competition is not so much as it was before, just on the ideology, but the competition is very much around economic hegemony and technological hegemony. There is a need. It's so important for the country to have people that are keeping an eye on that and can work with Canadian, can work with private sector, can identify some of the threats, deal with that. The risk, like what we've seen on critical infrastructure in the US, that some of critical infrastructure could be paralyzed. I think there's a way to sell that mission as a very cool mission with a nice James Bond team in the background.
Thanks, Tricia.
Yeah, I'm going to say three things. One, those are great comments, Danielle. I did touch on creativity and puzzles and problem solving, and I think that's extraordinary here. And I've worked in a number of government departments. There's nowhere else where I think you get to come and explore opportunities and innovation in quite that way. So the thoughtfulness that you can bring to bear on a particular investigation, it's really extraordinary, the creativity and the minds of the people that we have here. So that's attractive feature number one. Attractive feature number two is, I think we've made a massive efforts in the last couple of years. When I joined in 2014, I don't even recognize the place now in 2021 in the diversity and inclusion space, and in terms of continuing to evolve culture. There's a beautiful culture here that has existed for a long time, and I'll talk about that as the last point. but the elements of the culture that needed to modernize, that needed to transform, that needed to be more respectful, diverse, inclusive. I think there's been a huge amount of effort put into that, and I think we're seeing the fruits of that emerge. And it's an area of incredible importance to me personally and to the whole executive team. So I think it's a really good inclusive place that we're working continuously to build here. And then I guess the third thing that I would say is around dedication. And, I meet with the new incoming IO classes every once in a while. So, one of us at the senior level does that entry class, and you go around the room with the, however many people are in the room to ask, what brought you here? It's not just the intelligence officers, it's everybody that has just joined the service. It's their onboarding day. And you say, what brought you here? And almost every single person around the room will say, there's a couple that say, well, it's close to my home and it's a fast commute, but most of them will say that I'm here to keep my kids safe. And they will say, like, I have 2 daughters and I want them to be safe, or I have an elderly mother or family back home and they didn't have these opportunities. And there's an element about keeping people safe and how critically important that is to their dedication. And it never goes away. So everybody that works in this building, I genuinely believe they are here because they are deeply passionate about this mission. And again, having worked in many, many government departments, this place is incredibly special for that reason. And I think the national security community in general has that kind of ethos to that high service of protecting their country and their communities that I think is really profound. Thanks.
Thanks, Tricia. Leah?
For me, I would say you'll never be bored. You'll always be dealing with something new problems, new questions. Even if you sit in the same branch for years, what you're assessing and the issues that you're dealing with are going to change. And I don't think there's a ton of places where you can say that. As a lawyer, I will say you are at the forefront of legal issues, because if you're working in the national security intelligence community, you're working with new tech, you're working with the new problems, stuff that happens in the community happens before it hits elsewhere. And as a lawyer, that's a fantastic place to be, because you're dealing with novel legal issues. And I found that was incredible. And the last thing I'll say, specific to at least the institution I work with, I was at NSLAG, which is the Justice Department's legal team that services the CSIS. And I know they've been getting a lot of flack lately, but I will say that I found it incredible that as a first-year lawyer, I would be in front of the director and people like Tricia, and they'd be asking for my opinion and advice and assistance and guidance. If I was helping solve the problem, it didn't matter that I had only been around for a year or two. And I saw that consistently. Like, it was more about the quality of your contribution than where you were and who you were. And especially when you're trying to solve big national security problems, I found that incredibly rewarding. And so, yeah, I would commend, I didn't leave my job because I didn't like it or because I had issues. I just wanted to be able to talk publicly at all y'all. And I miss it every day. So I would strongly encourage people to consider the community.
Thank you. And I think that there are still lots of challenges certainly facing the security and intelligence community in Canada in terms of recruitment and retention, but those were excellent pitches to sort of help overcome some of those challenges, those logistical hurdles. I do notice that we're just about out of time here, so I just want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists and to the CIPS team, Anna and Mike, who've done a wonderful job in administering everything today. It's been a very dynamic panel, and thank you all so very much, and we'll see you tomorrow for our next session.